name's Patty McCarthy, and I am a board member of the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History, one of the sponsors of this event today, and I want to thank you all for coming and sharing history with us. This is a pretty lengthy presentation. I hope I don't lose you at some point during it, but I asked, because it is long, if we could hold all questions till the end. And I promise, even if we're out in the parking lot, I will answer any questions that I have the answers to. So this is a presentation on the Philadelphia County Prison Farm. And I first became interested in this subject as a grade school child. I attended St. Anselm School in Parkwood Manor, and I could sit in my classroom and actually watch the prisoners farming the fields with guards there and everything. So, I mean, I had this fascination from an early age. And as I got older and there were more avenues available to do research, it's been a passion of mine, and I'm always looking for and finding more information on it. It's been I'm not a young girl anymore, so it's been a very long 50+ year journey. But, so there's a lot to cover. Oh, wrong thing. I'm not starting off too good. Okay, by the late 1920s, Philadelphia County operated 3 prisons. The first to open was Moy-Mensing Prison, sometimes called the Reed Street Prison, and it was located at 10th and Reed Streets in South Philadelphia. The second was, this is a mouthful, the House of Correction, Employment, and Reformation for Adults and Minors in the city of Philadelphia, later and presently called the House of Correction. And it was built on State Road in the Northeast, and the building was built in 1874, but then it was knocked down in 1925. The granite that was used to build the House of Correction was mined from a quarry located directly across the road from the House of Correction. This quarry was later purchased by the city and became part of the House of Correction and was worked by the inmates. A new House of Correction was built on the original site using the original materials from the first building. It was built, as you can see, on the wheel and spoke design, the same as Eastern State Penitentiary. So the middle, the wheel is where the administration is, and all of the prisoners were in the different spokes. And that opened in 1927. The third prison was the Philadelphia County Prison at Holmesburg, or Holmesburg Prison. It was also in the Northeast, and it is located on Tarsdale Avenue. It opened in 1896, and again, it was on that same wheel and spoke design. Inmates from the Philadelphia County prisons and the House of Correction were required to work as part of their sentences, as they are today. There's no denying that the city was looking to benefit from prison labor. However, by the time Holmesburg opened, there was a different thought involved, that they wanted to actually train the prisoners so that they would be prepared for, post-incarceration employment, and hopefully they wouldn't end up back in prison if they had, jobs that they could depend on. There were jobs within the prison, some shown here, woodworking and the print shop. There was also baking and sewing and shoemaking, carpentry, mechanics, but the work that was outside the prison was quarry work and farming. This is a picture of the Holmesburg Prison is in the background with the quarry. This is the quarry all in here, and that's Holmesburg in the background. And the quarry work and farming had the added benefit that the inmates could enjoy the freedom of being outdoors. And as I said, the quarry was right across the street from the House of Correction and right, behind Holmesburg Prison, so it was very convenient. and the prisoners liked it. It was something, they were not forced. You had to work. You didn't have to work quarry work or farming work. And it was only the best behaved prisoners that were allowed to leave the prison. For the prison itself, the most lucrative of prisoner occupations was farming. The populations of the prisons and other city-run institutions was always on the rise, and that meant more mouths to feed, which of course translated to the need for more food. And this is actually, prisoners working the farm. The city was looking for more farmland. And in 1877, they leased a large estate in Torresdale, which is an area now considered Upper Holmesburg. And it was on the river, and it was owned by the late Joseph Harrison, Jr. He was a designer of locomotives, and he built the Russian Railroad. The estate was on the Delaware between the Pennypack Creek and 11 Mile Lane, which is now Linden Avenue. The prison was using the large acreage for crops to benefit the prisons and city institutions. This land was farmed by the House of Correction until 1902, when the city purchased the property for the Torresdale Water Treatment Plant, which is now known as the Samuel S. Baxter Water Treatment Plant. So after the sale of Harrison's farm, the city bought another large, well-known nearby estate. This was the home and property of Alexander Brown, who was a partner in Brown Brothers Banking of Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Boston, and it's now known today as Brown Brothers Harriman Company. The extensive property already included mature orchards and open fields that had been previously farmed. This is all included in Brown's property. It was initially, the estate was called Spring Hill. That was Alexander Brown's home. And it was used as a home for indigent women. They moved up to Riverview at Rawn and State Road. And in 1920, the building became the home for dependent children. These were indigent children, most of whom were crippled by polio or missing limbs from birth defects or accidents. The ground surrounding the house was farmed by prisoners. This part of the property was on the east side of Torresdale Avenue. So right here is Spring Hill. That was the estate. And here's Torresdale Avenue, which is much smaller than it is today. There's a close-up of Spring Hill. And as you can see in here, there's a playground for the kids, and there's farming structures over here. Also in 1920, the part of Brown's farm that was situated on the west side of Torresdale Avenue was where Camp Happy was established, if any of you have ever heard of Camp Happy. This was a summer camp for children suffering from TB or in danger of contracting TB due to malnourishment. And even with Camp Happy and the Home for Dependent Children, there was plenty of farmland around these institutions for the prison to raise crops. Alexander Brown's property went all the way out to Frankfort Avenue. So it was on, the east side of Torresdale, all the way up to Frankfort. So there was plenty of farmland. This is part of Camp Happy. You can see the tents set up here, the swimming pool here, buildings with children here, but you can also see sections that are being farmed. And this went way east. In addition, the city looked to the success of Byberry farms in the extreme northern boundary of the city in the Byberry section. Byberry farms began in 1907 as a small work farm for those suffering from TB also, and it had grown significantly over the years. And this was, these buildings were around the Thornton and Byberry areas. The relatively small Byberry farms became part of a much larger Philadelphia Hospital for Mental Diseases, and construction of the various buildings of Byberry Hospital took over 10 years to complete. All right, we should discuss here for a moment Byberry Farms versus the prison farm that I'm coming to talk to you about today. Many people believe they're one and the same. You can see on the map that they are two separate things. So Byberry Farms, before the Byberry buildings were built, Byberry Hospital buildings, went from Townsend Road all the way out to the boulevard. And this area here is the prison farms. So they sat side by side. Byberry Farms was under the jurisdiction of the Department of Public Health, and the prison farm was part of the Bureau of Charities and Correction under the Department of Public Welfare. In January 1931, the Board of Inspectors of Prisons announced that a new prison with a large prison farm would be built adjacent to Byberry Farms and the Hospital for Mental Diseases. They felt this was an ideal location for several reasons. One, there were already several family farms in the properties that they were going to buy. So they knew that the ground was good for growing, and there had been successful farms there. Two, it was very far from the dense population of the city. This was about as far as you could go and still be within the city. And three, the city had already invested $15 million in the installation of electricity, water, sewers, and a sewage system for Byberry Hospital. So they figured the prison could tap into that. A minute. Notice here, this is the prison farm, but notice here there's this one little area that's carved out. And that area is Mechanicsville. Initially, the plan was to include Mechanicsville in the sale, and I'm not sure when that was taken out of the mix, but by the summer of 1931, it was not part of the deal. Mechanicsville is a small village that sits mostly on or across the road from the Perquesson Creek, which is the northern border of the city from Bucks County. The early definition of a mechanic is one who is skilled in manual labor, and the original inhabitants of Mechanicsville were mill workers and owners, farm machinery mechanics, blacksmiths, carpenters, wheelwrights, and harness makers. And this is what, in 1900, the village of Mechanicsville looked like. It had a total of 18 homes in that time, and it doesn't have much more now. It has done a little growing, but not much. And you can see, here's the Perquesson. So it is, right along, right there. Now there's a picture of Mechanicsville from the road in 1960. This is it last week. And it's basically, everything's basically the same. It's just very overgrown now. But, here are the, little fences along the Black Lake Run, which is a tributary of the Perquesson. Over here is the bridge, the Century Lane Bridge, and there's this big tall house here and other buildings. And that's Mechanicsville Road. It was a foregone conclusion who would be the architect of the new prison. A man named Philip H. Johnson had been awarded a controversial contract for life as architect for the city of Philadelphia Department of Health. And he was awarded this through the influence of his influential brother-in-law, Israel W. Durham, who was a political boss in a time when there was a lot of shady politics going on. I'm sorry?
Unlike today.
And before this 1903 contract, Johnson had worked for the Philadelphia Department of Engineering and Surveys, but he had no architectural experience. Johnson held the position for 30 years until his death in 1933. During that period, an average city worker would have earned about $100,000 a year over the course of 30 years. Johnson earned $2 million as a result of the terms of his contract. And many administrations in the city tried to break the contract, but it always held up in court. This is where it might get a little tedious, but I think it's important because it gives you an idea of what was going on and who the neighborhood was before the farm. Okay, so this is where they were actually going to build the prison buildings. So the purchase of 6 properties was approved, and later a 7th would be added for the prison buildings. and a large prison farm. The city wanted to pay the owners $350 an acre. The owners wanted $800 to $1,000 an acre. So they did a lot of negotiating, and they came up with $600 an acre. So this property of Harry and Simon's was chosen. So this was in the very northern part, and it was a little separate from the rest. So the farm would be in the other areas, and this is where the prison buildings would be. And it was the property of his wife's, Simon's wife, her maternal grandfather, Thornton Stackhouse. And when he died, his wife sold it to the city with her children. So basically, she was selling her grandfather's property. And it was a total of 52.75 acres. This is what the house and barn looked like, and they were torn down and the land cleared in preparation for prison construction. The buildings were in poor condition anyway, and the 3 guards and 16 prisoners went daily by trucks with their lunches to tear down the buildings. The Prison Board of Inspectors decided that any of the buildings or houses that were in good shape would be kept and should be used in order to avoid vandalism. So as you can see up here, this is not working. This is Simon's property that I just talked about. So you can see the rest of the property. It's rather big. There's a little area that's cut out in there, Mechanicsville. All right, so it was going to be over 250 acres, and they were going to be a very considerate resident of the Northeast, these prisoners. The Evan Townsend property, which is very big there, was also an estate coming from another family with a long history in Byberry. Evan was a local boy, and he married Cora Mae States, who lived just across the Pequessing, and he inherited the land from his uncle Thomas Townsend. However, Thomas owed more on the property than it was worth. So a brother-in-law stepped in, bought it, so before Evan could raise the money, and then Evan bought it back, and eventually they sold to the city, and it was 92 plus acres of land, and it was sold to the city in August of '31. This is the Townsend House, which was raised shortly after the city purchased the property. And it has an interesting history. It was almost 225 years old when it was demolished. It was built by James Carver, son of John and Mary Carver, who came to Pennsylvania with William Penn. James was married to Hannah Townsend, and it is said that the house was continuously occupied by members of either the Carver or Townsend family for that entire time, from the time it was built to the time it was torn down. The Townsend family had many farm buildings, and they were on the other side of Mechanicsville Road. So the house was on the side closest to the Pequessing, and all the farm buildings were on the other side of Mechanicsville Road. And one of these buildings that they had was this huge bank barn, and the city deemed that it was sturdy and would be used by the prison. This is what the barn looked like in 1948 after it was modernized and repaired. This is what it looks like today, and I don't know whether you can make this out. I wish this was working. Oh, it is now. Okay, so you can see the sidewall here. You can make out the same windows, same door. It's just a shell now. It's a huge shell that's, what's standing still looks pretty sturdy, but it's very graffitied. It's got trees growing out from the middle of it, and that is, you can find that and see that along the Pequessing Creek Trail if you go through Parkwood Manor behind the playground, and there's a walking trail back there. All right, now these two properties actually are in Mechanicsville. They're the two last properties on the southern side of Mechanicsville Road. One was owned at the time by James L. Gifford, the other by Roy Townsend, who was Evan's son. This is the James L. Gifford house, what it looked like back when it was purchased by the city. And this is what it looks like today. It's not too many changes. It was in good shape. It was built in 1821. It was in good shape, so the city kept it and rented it for $15 a month. And the rent was to be paid directly to the city treasurer. And the owners, my husband Jack and I have talked to the man that owns the house, and they take great pride in, they went down to the surface and they've matched the paint and everything as it was back in the day. So they take great pride in their house. This was Roy Townsend's house. And it sat at the very end of the village, and as I said, he was Evan's son. And after the city purchased this, they decided to hire a guard to patrol the grounds to hopefully prevent vandalism. And he was permitted, the guard was permitted to live in the house rent-free. And this is the house then and now. The next property we're going to talk about is the, I'm missing a page, is the Francis P. Morel estate. Now, he is not related to Edward Morel and Louise Morel of Morel Park fame. But the Morels did live in the area, and his middle name is Parry, and the Parrys were a big name in the area also. When Francis married, he married Sarah Bunting, who owns this property. Her father owned this property. Now, Thomas Bunting actually owned it all. Francis and Sarah bought the property from him, and he just kept this little piece, 2 little parcels down on Dunks Ferry Road. And Francis and his wife kept the rest, and they raised 2 sons there and had a farm. These were barn and, no, 2 shots of the house that Francis and Sarah Morel lived in. And they didn't tear down this house right away either. A farmer that worked the Byberry Farms lived in there for a very long time. The next property was owned by L. Paul Knight. His name was Lukens Paul Knight, but apparently he always went by Paul. And as you can see, this property straddles Mechanicsville Road. So if you're familiar with Parkwood Manor, this is Mechanicsville. This is Dunks Ferry Road. So most of the playground, most of the ball fields, that's what this encompasses. This little piece over here is where the gym is today, and that's where the house was on that property. There were issues when they were buying this house. When they first decided that this was the area that the city was going to look at, it was owned by someone named Robert Stradley. He had bought it from Paul Knight. For some reason, all of a sudden, it's not owned by Paul and Robert Stradley, it's owned by Tacony Trust Company. So the city feels very sure they're going to get this property, but they have to wait and see what Tacony Trust is going to do. Then the next thing you know, it's in the hands of the sheriff. So you would figure, since the city is buying up all this property, they would just get it from the sheriff. But for some reason, and I don't know why and can't find out why, the sheriff sold it back to Paul Knight. So now this is now taking a whole year in their negotiations, but he finally sold it to the city. And as you can see, when they did this proposed map, they were including Mechanicsville as part of the sale at this early juncture. But you can see they left out the Knight property. So maybe there was some question as to whether they were going to get it or not. And that's what the Knight house looked like, where, as I said, where Parkwood's gym is now. The next and last property was not part of the original plan, but the city had an opportunity to buy it, and they did. Again, it's large. It goes all the way from Mechanicsville Road all the way to the creek. And it's on both sides of Dunks Ferry Road. And it's owned by Arthur and Maureen Bonner. And, at first I couldn't find, I knew Bonner was a name in the area. He actually grew up where the 94th Aero Squadron is, if anyone remembers. I'm really dating myself here. But and you know, his wife was from that area too. So I figured, well, this is a name that's familiar. Well, I find out that Arthur Bonner's maternal grandfather had owned the land at one time. He was a knight. So Paul Knight and Arthur Bonner are cousins. So, you know, you can see all these family connections, and these property had been in these families for generations and generations. And, you know, Giles Knight came over with a pen and owned, you know, all this property, and eventually, you know, it got passed down in parcels to some of his ancestors and everything. So I figure, you know, there had to have been, it was a hard decision to sell these houses. And the Knight house, by the way, was torn down shortly after, because that was in really bad shape. So when they bought the Bonner house, this was being leased at the time of the purchase, and they decided to honor that lease. But in 1939, the renters were evicted because they wanted to tear down the house and move on. So here we are at this stage of the game. It's, you know, 1932, it's fall. All these properties are bought. They've torn down buildings and all. Plans are made, but there's still no prison. And you know why? And there's several factors that I'm sure went into that. And one of them was that the superintendent of prisons died suddenly in February of 1932. And he was being replaced by the medical director of prisons, who was going to, still had to keep his job as the medical director, but now he's the acting superintendent of prisons. So he's got, you know, all this work. So I guess they figured, well, we'll hold off a little on making any big changes, because he had only agreed to take the job for a year. The next, and that's who it was, Frederick S. Baldy. I'm sure also from the Northeast you've heard of Baldy Middle School and everything. CCA Baldy was Frederick's father. All right, next thing, the architect dies. He dies very unexpectedly. So that's going to put some problems into the plans. And we have to remember too that we were in the middle of the Great Depression. So the city had less to spend on big projects, so a lot of things were being put on hold. And the last was that Mayor J. Hampton Moore would not, he had just been reelected. Well, he had actually served a four-year term as mayor. And then there were two mayors after him, and then he was reelected as mayor. So he didn't want to accept any federal money. He was a Republican, and he was afraid that if he took federal money, Democrats would get jobs. And he would rather them not have jobs than hire Democrats. So it made Philadelphia was very behind most major cities in recovering from the Depression. And also those two mayors that were in between his two terms, he blamed them for all this debt that Philadelphia had. Now, I mean, they were all Republicans, so it's not like he was blaming someone, you know, the other party. He just said he had done a really good job before, and these other people, they messed it all up for him. So in the next couple years, the question was always asked. It was in the papers, and people wanted to know, where is the prison? When are you going to build the prison? And the answer was always at various forms of, well, when we get the money, that's when we'll build the prison. All right, there had been, when they bought most of the properties, it was 1931, and it was the summer. So there was a minimal harvest in that year from the properties, because some of them, it was a condition of sale that they get to keep their harvest. But the lack of funds also forced the Board of Inspectors to operate the prison on a shoestring. So they didn't have much more to deal with than some shovels, hoes, picks, a couple of horses, a plow, some seeds. By 1933, they had a truck, and they borrowed a tractor, and they got some other farm equipment. So we're moving forward, but then, oh, that was tomato harvest. In 1933, they planted 10,000 tomato plants. And they also planted cabbage and corn. So that's harvesting tomatoes. And it looks a lot different from the pristine farms that we think of today. I mean, the weeds are as high as the tomato plants. But of course, they didn't have the equipment. You know, they're all doing this manually. So in 1938, we have tragedy at the Holmesburg Prison. As a disciplinary measure after a food strike, prisoners were placed in what was called the Klondike. It was mid-August, it had steam heat, it was turned on. We were in the middle of a very bad heat wave. The steam heat was turned on, the temperature rose to 190 degrees. And after 58 hours, 4 inmates were found roasted to death. They said that their skin literally peeled off their bodies. So on September 2nd, 2 weeks later, the superintendent of prisons was relieved of his duties, and Frederick S. Baldy was asked to again become the superintendent of prisons. He still had to keep the medical director job, but so he did agree to take it. Now, Baldy was very interested in farming in general, but he was especially interested in agricultural innovations, and he wanted to apply any new technology to the prison farm. He actually owned a farm himself later in life. But he had existing buildings modernized, a boiler house and pump house built, water lines and electricity installed, and this barn had been part of the Morel property, and it was now called Prison Farm Barn Number 2. And you can see it being renovated there. Barn number 3 was built very close to barn number 2, and that was built from the ground up. That was a new building, very big, as you can see. In 1946, greenhouses were built, and the greenhouses would enable the farmers to get an early start on the crops for each season. This is the interior of the greenhouses, and this is all that's left of the greenhouses today, just the columns of the foundation. This is in very close proximity to where that barn, the remains of the barn that I showed you earlier are. And this is the front. And the greenhouses is, you can see the greenhouses in the back. And I'm not really sure, these were, you know, part of the whole farm administration maybe, office buildings maybe, I don't know. But this is what it looks like today. Again, a shell. And you can see, like down this end here, you can see the peak part, the windows, and it's the same right here. So the prisoners, by this time, it's now a full-fledged prison. They're not even prison farm. They're not even talking prison anymore. So this gives you an idea of the variety of crops that they built. You know, I'm going to have to take a deep breath. They farmed carrots, corn, cabbage, asparagus, beets, tomatoes, turnips, string beans, lima beans, kidney beans, green pod beans, Davis white beans, I don't know, navy beans, squash, cucumbers, eggplant, radishes, lettuce, sweet potatoes, peppers, kale, spinach, potatoes, rye, and wheat. And in the early 1960s, programs were established for growing carrots and corn to feed the animals at the Philadelphia Zoo. So it went far beyond just, you know, feeding the prisoners. And that's one of the guards inspecting the carrot crop. And the potatoes was by far one of the largest crops. And there were potato cellars, a couple of them on the property, to store the potatoes after they were dug up. And potatoes were actually, after, you know, stored, they were bagged on the property before being transported. In 1942, Dr. Baldy established an expanded farm program that was aimed at tripling the crops that had been previously grown. And the first step in the program was to hire Cletus L. Goodland. He was the former director of the National Farm School, and he was given the position of supervisor of the prison farm. And Goodledge was knowledgeable in cutting-edge farming technology. The prison farm did its best to support the war effort. The farm was a gold medal award winner at the Victory Garden Harvest Show, held in October of 1942 at the Convention Hall in Philadelphia. The sign states that the prison farm produced 1,700,000 pounds of farm products consumed by city and county institutions. And as you can see, their display took up a pretty good amount of space. In 1943, as part of the growth of the prison farm, a cannery was built just outside the walls of Holmesburg Prison to preserve the crops for use when the growing season was over. This was the first municipality-owned cannery in the country. It was projected to save the city from between $150,000 to $200,000 a year. By 1947, the cannery was already too small and construction began on an addition. That's what it looked like with the addition. By 1949, the production was such that the cannery was operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And these are some pictures of the interior of the cannery. And some of the prisoners cutting beans, skinning tomatoes. And farming, as you can imagine, is hard, back-breaking work. And the prisoners did get meal breaks at a mess hall that was built at the farm. And they also had recreational time where they could enjoy things like pitching horseshoes, which is what they're doing there. These are some of the buildings. This is the big barn that you still see the remnants of in the background. And these are other just, you know, it looks like garages, and this might even be the mess hall, I'm not sure. So as a result of the Philadelphia Home Charter Rule of 1951, the city and county of Philadelphia governments were consolidated, and all of the county functions were now administered by city government. This change would affect the management of the prison system. And in December of 1953, Dr. Frederick Baldy resigned as superintendent without notice. And different things that, you know, articles sort of, and then even the minutes of the Board of Inspectors sort of indicated he wasn't real happy with the changes from going from county to city. But the records indicate that the timing of Baldy's exit also coincides with the beginning of the end of the prison farm. In 1954, the city had a critical need for a city cemetery for the indigent. Northeast Philadelphia's Potter's Field was carved out of the prison farmland at the very edge of the city on the east side of Dunks Ferry Road, just south of Pequesson Creek. This was a part of the Bonner property before. In 1956, this stone monument was erected, and it had a bronze plaque identifying it as the city's cemetery, Philadelphia City Cemetery. As you can see, the plaque is long gone, but the monument is still there. Burials at Potter's Field, the Holmesburg prisoners would come up to bury the bodies, and residents of Parkwood Manor often attended. I'm a member of St. Anselm Parish, and one of our deacons there was with the police force at the time, and he would, you know, say prayers at the burials often. And they had, you know, Jewish rabbis come. It was all different denominations, faiths, and everything at different points in time. But they always wanted to acknowledge these people that were being buried, geez. You can see here, they're taking the bodies out of a U-Haul truck. So next time you run a U-Haul truck, you might wonder what happened before. And the caskets were very inexpensive fiberboard that over years kind of just fell apart within the earth, and, you know, the graves were sinking in a little. Each grave was marked by a small stone that had a number on it, and the city files, you know, showed the circumstances around that death if they knew them. Most people they actually did identify. they were usually just too poor to have for their family to bury them. The only real tombstone that was of any note at the time was very early in the cemetery's history, and that was the tombstone from the case, the very famous Philadelphia case called the Boy in the Box. He is now known, you know, the little boy's body was found in a cardboard box in Box Chase, and he was buried there in 1957, February 25th, 1957 was the date that he was found. And the police department of Philadelphia really took this child to their own. They chipped in, they bought the tombstone, they would go and different members put flowers on the grave all the time. As kids, we put flowers on the grave all the time, but they kept this case to their hearts until, you know, I think they're all gone now, all the police, and they've never solved the case. He was exhumed, his body was exhumed, and the remains were, you know, analyzed for DNA and everything by the VDOC Society, and they still haven't gotten any answers. He was reburied in Ivy Hill Cemetery in 1998, and now instead of the Boy in the Box, he's known as America's Unknown Child. The cemetery was decommissioned in 1987. The grounds today look much the same as they did 65 years ago. Last August, 7 unidentified bodies were exhumed from Potter's Field in the hopes that today's technology, including DNA testing, would help in identifying them. And over the years, approximately 550 bodies were buried in Potter's Field. In the late 50s and 60s, housing developments, this is another reason why the farm just kept getting smaller and smaller. Housing developments were being built in the Byberry area, and the largest being Parkwood Manor, built by Hyman Corman. It was literally across Dunks Ferry Road from some of the prison fields. And the prisoners were no longer working in the middle of nowhere. Now they're practically in your backyard. So this is Dunks Ferry Road, new houses, you know, they don't even have doors and windows in them yet. It was obviously in the wintertime, there's snow on. But this is where the ball fields are, the playground. These were farms. These were part of the prison farms. So that's the houses, that's the prison farms. So in 1962, the city needed land in Fox Chase. The Archdiocese needed land to build a church to serve this exploding community. So a deal was struck which basically exchanged deeds. St. Anselm Church on Dunks Ferry Road was built on prison farmland that had once been a small part of the Morel property. Now it was just the church that was part of the prison farm. The school and now the gym were two other properties, but the church was prison farm property. That's St. Anselm. So this shows you the construction of St. Anselm Church, and you can see in the background barn number 2 and barn number 3. So when the school, you know, was going to be over here, so when I said, you know, you looked out and you saw them farming as a kid, you really did. So now, as I said, they're losing property all the time. Potter's Field, they lost that property. St. Anselm, they lost that property. And there was also concerns being voiced about this large juvenile population and prisoners working unrestrained, you know, around all these kids. So people were concerned about that. And also, according to an interview with the acting superintendent of prisons, and I quote, "The new neighbors robbed us blind." In other words, they would come over and would pick at night. And as a kid, I know there were many apple fights involved from the orchards, and it's a wonder we didn't all have, you know, concussions. And then they also built in 1969 Parkwood Playground. And so 1968 was the last harvest, and the city began to now, in earnest, repurpose the land. So as I said, this was what Parkwood Playground initially looked like. And it was a pirate ship in this part. It was a brick pirate ship and, you know, tunnels, slides. And this was all full of sand. And it was a very large community litter box for every stray cat in the neighborhood. It was fun. The good old days, right? Okay. So then in the 1980s, Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation, or PIDC, began developing an industrial park site on a portion of the land that had been Byberry Farms and some of the prison farm. And this was located on the east side of Townsend Road and the prison farm part. And this parcel presently includes manufacturing facilities, the northeast campus of Community College, the Mid-Atlantic Division of the National Archives, just to name a few. So, you know, I just feel it went from these plans of a prison, which wouldn't our landscape be much different today had that been built. And because it was there, and it was there for such a long time, it left a legacy to the city of Philadelphia that we can look back on now. It's a final resting place for some of the city's poor and unwanted, a church, a college, an industrial park, community playground and gym, playing fields to be enjoyed by the kids, Questing Creek Trail and Park, walking trail and bike trail. And, you know, I think lots happened, but I think it needs to be remembered. And not too many people, even that live in the area, know about it. So that's the end. I do want to give credit to Mr. Bob Eskin. He was the former Public Relations Director for the Department of Corrections. And, you know, I had been searching, as I said, a 50-year journey for all this information. And my husband and I, we went over to Kern Fromhold Correctional Facility. He opened up his archives to us. Some of these pictures, no one knows about. I don't think the people at the House of Corrections know about them for the most part. And I also want to thank Tim McCusker, who helped restore the photos. So, does anyone have any questions? Questions? Yes.
Potter's Field, do you have, is there somewhere that they have knowledge of people that are there?
Yes.
That they remain?
Yes.
Repeat the question.
Okay. The gentleman wanted to know if there is any record of who is buried in Potter's Field. And yes, there is. Down at the city morgue, they have that. And in some cases, you know, there were stories told about a man who he was killed by the person sitting next to him in a bar. He sat next to that person every day, but the person didn't know his name. They got in a fight, you know, so he was one of the unidentified. But there were a lot of babies, unfortunately, that were buried there. People that their families just did not have the money. So their names are recorded.
You have to go to the city morgue.
Yes. Yes. Anyone else? Yes.
Are the bodies still, all the bodies have been removed from that?
No. The only bodies that have been removed are the boy in the box and the 7 that were exhumed last summer. And most people do know that that is a Potter's Field there. Most people do assume that all the bodies have been removed, but they have not.
Basically all those bodies, their locations were all unmarked?
No. They know, well, approximately. There were stones at the time, and, you know, kids have taken the stones and all. But just by the dimensions and all, when they were exhuming, they were looking in particular for one body last year. And they, you know, didn't have it right at first, and they moved over like a foot and all. So they had a general idea.
They have a plot plan for the whole
Yes,
property?
yes, they do, yes. Yeah.
Kids go play soccer and skin their knees. It could be on anyone.
Yeah, it could, it could. Any other questions? Yes. I'm sorry, I can't. How much money? did the city get?
No, the owner.
The owners got, most of them got $600 an acre. The Knights and the $600 an acre is what most of the people got. The Knights and the Bonners got $550 an acre. So, you know, that sounded like a lot to me until I got out my calculator. You know, it really wasn't. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you all.